You're doing this wrong if you think loving harder will finally make them open up. Research from the University of Michigan shows that 68% of people in anxious-avoidant relationships spend more emotional energy managing their partner's wounds than processing their own. I see this with my clients every day. They come to me exhausted, burned out, and confused, not because the relationship was hard, but because they were working twice as hard inside it. They were doing therapy for two people, and only one of them was in the room. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what happens when you stop healing the avoidant and start healing yourself, because what comes next will surprise you. For months, maybe years, you try to heal them. You explained yourself when they went cold. You stayed patient when they pulled away. You reassured them when their own fear made them distant. You learned their triggers better than your own. You adjusted your tone, your timing, your needs, all of it shaped around what they could handle. And you told yourself this was love, that this is what it looks like to care deeply about someone. Then one day, quietly, without a big announcement or a dramatic conversation, you stopped. Not because you gave up, but because you finally ran out of the energy it takes to love someone who was never letting you in. That pause, that stopping, is where everything begins to change. Before you understand what happens next, you need to understand what you were actually doing before. Because most people in this dynamic believe they were being supportive, patient, emotionally mature, and on the surface, it looked that way, but underneath, something else was happening. You weren't just supporting them. You were regulating their emotion for them. Every time they went quiet, you filled the silence. Every time they pulled back, you moved closer to compensate. Every time their fear created distance, your anxiety pushed you to close the gap. You were carrying emotional weight that was never yours to carry, and you were doing it so consistently that neither of you noticed it had become the structure of the entire relationship. They leaned on your pursuit without ever asking for it, and you gave it without ever questioning whether it was working. It wasn't. And somewhere deep down, you already knew that. The shift doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a single question changing inside you. For a long time, the question running in the background of everything was, are we okay? You asked it directly sometimes. Other times you just felt it, that low hum of anxiety checking and rechecking the temperature of the relationship. But at some point, the question changes. Quietly, without fanfare, it becomes, am I okay? And that is an emotional pivot that changes everything. Because the moment you start asking about yourself, your needs, your feelings, your exhaustion, you stop being fully organized around them. And they feel that shift before you even fully understand it yourself. Here's what most people expect to happen next. They expect a confrontation, a reaction, some kind of acknowledgement that something has changed. But that's not how avoidance works. At first, there's nothing, no accusation, no dramatic response. They don't sit you down and say, they notice you pulling back. They don't ask if you're okay. On the surface, everything looks the same, but underneath, something is registered. Avoidants are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional withdrawal, even while appearing not to care. Their entire system is built around detecting shifts in closeness and distance. So while they say nothing, they're noticing everything. The texts that used to come with worry behind them now come without it. The energy that used to chase them is no longer chasing. And that registers in a way that words never could. What you actually removed when you stopped overfunctioning was something they had been quietly depending on. When you were constantly focused on their emotional state, you were doing a kind of invisible labor, absorbing the discomfort of the dynamic so they didn't have to sit with it. When you stopped fixing their moods, suddenly they had to feel their own feelings without a buffer. When you stopped explaining your worth, they had to confront the silence you left behind. When you stopped chasing reassurance, the anxiety that the dynamic had always carried stopped landing on you and started landing where it actually originated, with them. And that is deeply unfamiliar territory for someone who has spent their whole life avoiding exactly this kind of discomfort. This is where the control shift happens. Avoidants regulate their relationships through distance. They create space when things feel too close, and they rely on their partner's pursuit to keep the dynamic stable. Your anxiety was, in a strange way, their security, because as long as you were chasing, they knew where they stood. They had the luxury of pulling back because you were always holding the rope. But when you stopped chasing, not with anger, not with an ultimatum, just with calm and quiet detachment. You become unpredictable and someone who regulates. Their entire sense of safety through emotional control cannot handle unpredictability. You didn't threaten to leave. You didn't make demands. You simply stopped orbiting them, and suddenly they had no way to read you anymore. From here, one of two things happens. The first possibility is that they lean in. Your independence, your stillness, your refusal to chase creates something they haven't felt before. A genuine pull toward you, not because you're playing a game, but because the version of you that isn't desperate for their approval is, paradoxically, more attractive than the version that was. They may reach out differently, more directly, less guarded, because you're healing quietly. Challenges them to show up more honestly. The second possibility is that they pull way further, because leaning in requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what they've spent their whole life avoiding. They double down on distance. They find reasons to disengage. And in doing so, they answer a question you've been asking for a long time without realizing it. Think about which of these responses you've been hoping for, and then ask yourself whether you've been healing yourself or performing healing in hopes that one of these outcomes would follow. That distinction matters more than most people want to admit, because here's the real outcome. The biggest shift that happens when you stop healing the avoidant isn't theirs. It's yours. When you genuinely turn your attention inward, not as a strategy not to make them miss you, but because you actually start caring about your own interior life, you stop needing their potential. You stop living in the future version of the relationship where they finally open up and everything you waited for arrives. You start living in the present, in reality, with a person as they actually are rather than who they could be if they just healed enough. And once you stop needing their potential, the dynamic changes permanently, not because you change them, but because you change what you're willing to accept, what you're willing to wait for, and what you now understand you deserve. You begin to see things you couldn't see before. You see that the longing you confuse with love was partly anxiety wearing a familiar face. You see that the passion you felt in the push-pull wasn't chemistry. It was your nervous system responding to an old wound being pressed. You see that real love isn't supposed to feel like a constant audition. These aren't easy realizations. They come with grief attached, because understanding them means accepting that what you were fighting for may not have been what you thought it was. But that grief is also a doorway. On the other side of it is a version of yourself that doesn't need chaos to feel alive. That can sit with someone who is actually available and feel attraction instead of suspicion. That understands intimacy as safety, not intensity. You were not responsible for healing them. That was never your job, no matter how much it felt like it was. Their wounds came before you. Their patterns were built long before you arrived. And no amount of your patience, your love, your emotional labor was ever going to reach in and rewire what was formed in childhood. The only person whose healing you are responsible for is yourself. And when you choose that calmly, without drama, without making about them, one of two things becomes clear. Either the relationship begins to transform, because your healing creates space for genuine growth to happen between you, or it reveals what it always was, a dynamic held together by your overfunctioning, which was never going to survive your wholeness. Either way, you get your answer. Either way, you stop waiting. And that, the ending of the wait, the returning to yourself, the quiet decision to stop shrinking, that is not a loss. That is the most important thing you will ever do inside any relationship. Not for them, for you, because the energy you were giving to someone who couldn't receive it doesn't disappear when you stop giving it. It comes back to you. And what you do with it next, that's where your real life begins.